So please join me in welcoming Helen Burnham.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to such a big crowd for coming out today. This is very exciting. I am just going to turn on my stopwatch so I have a sense of how long the talk has gone. So yes, we are going to talk about the exhibition, but we are going to talk in more general terms about the last 14 years of Matisse's life and his focus during that time on the cutouts, which everyone loves, and the drawings of that period, which I love. I also like the cutouts too, who doesn't? So first of all, a quick look at our handout for today on late drawings and cutouts. I would add to the selected readings that I encourage you to see. Well, first of all, notice that there are some online resources that you can use to see Matisse in action, and we'll show you some of that in the talk today. But it's really wonderful that there's been so much developed online around this topic, and in no small part due to the MoMA curators who put together the Cutouts exhibition a few years ago, one of whom, as Kristen said, is coming next Wednesday to speak with us in our annual Boardingham lecture. On the back of the sheet, there are some key terms and key dates. And now I'm going to give you a little overview of the history of this period while we look at this photograph of Matisse's studio in Nice in about 1853, so a year from his death. 1953, thank you. Yes, 1953, color photography of Matisse. Wait, which artist are we talking about? Okay. So one thing you might notice, since you're all ready to interact with me, what is different about the work in this studio than in a studio you might have seen in 1853? Anyone? It's a lot of color. Yes, it's a photograph in color. That's different. The works are on the walls. No easels. Huge. That basically says it. There are no easels. The works are on the walls. They are movable. And we're going to talk about technique in about 2 seconds after I give you a biographical overview of this period, because technique is really at the heart of this talk. Okay, so we're starting in the 1940s, and why is that? Well, in 1946, Matisse turns down an offer from his dealer, Paul Rosenberg, of a new contract because he says that he just no longer wants to make paintings, but rather work on what he calls decorations. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're looking at in this room. Decoration, space, expansive space, the space around the artist, but it also has a more specific meaning in terms of the history of art that we'll get into in a minute. But basically, for this talk, you can keep in mind that after a certain point, he essentially only focuses on his cutouts and his drawings, and he gives up major paintings. And that is from about 1950 on. Until his death in 1954. He does not make any more paintings. 2 of his last great paintings are actually in the exhibition downstairs. They're called the Voss Interiors. And those are the 2 that two of the ones that he basically makes before he turns to cutouts and drawings. But why this period of about 1940 to 1954? Why not just talk about 1950 then, when he gives up painting altogether, and talk about those last 4 years? Well, this period of about 14 years is what he referred to as his second life. And it starts in about 1940 in wartime with his separation from his wife, Amélie, which was really a crisis moment in his life. And then his abdominal surgery in 1941, which led to him being much more infirm. He was confined to his bed and to a wheelchair, and affected his life enormously, but not his energy and his artistic contribution. So during this period, for the most part, he is here in Nice, in the south of France on the Mediterranean, and in Vence, which is near Nice. So he starts out in 1917 in Nice. That's when he moves there from Paris and from Issy, which is near Paris. So he's moving to an area which is full of light and color, the sea air. Then he moves to right outside of the center of Nice, to Cimiez, where you can find the Musée Matisse now, and I highly encourage you to visit it. And then, during the war, he moves to Vence. And even when he moves back to Nice, he keeps a studio in Vence. So he continues to work in these two different places. So, as we head into technique, I want you to keep in mind a few themes and ideas that are going to run through the lecture. One of them is the idea of drawing with scissors. Another is uniting color and line. Essential forms, expansive space, so moving beyond easel painting. The studio as a work of art, and this idea of decoration. But first, the cutout technique. And why are we starting with technique? Well, first of all, I should confess that partly it's technical because this is the first time I've done a PowerPoint lecture where there will be animated parts to it, and I was worried that it might not work. But the other one, the more art historical reason, is that everybody asks about technique. If you talk about Matisse, they want to know how you make the cutouts. And I think a lot of that has to do with the freshness of that technique. It kind of begs the question. It still seems new and innovative, and it seems very material. It invites touch. It invites the idea that it could be that these cutouts could be moved around, that they're still in process, that they might change. So how did he start doing them? Well, first of all, he had papers painted for them. He didn't start with paper that was pre-colored. He started with white paper that was painted with something called gouache, which is watercolor. It's an opaque watercolor. It works. These I took from the MoMA website. They're now red. And he very carefully selected pigments that were standard colors that you could reproduce with printer's inks from a company called the Linnell Company. But when you look very closely at the cutouts, and you can go and look at some of them in the exhibition, you'll see that they are painted in varying shades of these colors in terms of the density of the opaque watercolor. And he carefully selects these pre-painted papers from drawers where they're housed, and then cuts them. Here he is, still in Nice, in this Hôtel Regina, which is right outside of Nice in Cimiez, near the Musée Matisse Nice. You see a cutout in the background, and you see him with these really large scissors, which are very heavy, actually. And he's not clipping away at the paper, rather so this is one of the problems with this one. It looks like he's clipping. When he moves his scissors, you'll see in a second, it's much more of a carving. So here he's making a drawing. See how he moves the paper? I'll do it again. So it's less clipping than carving. Okay. So there's the question of the studio assistants. He had a group of studio assistants, and they were managed by somebody named Lydia Delectorskaya, who basically managed his life after his wife left him. His studios, his studio assistants, managerial things. She and his daughter Marguerite worked together. This is not Lydia Delectorskaya, but actually this is a photograph taken by her of a studio assistant who's holding a hammer in her hand because she is going to pin the cutouts to the wall. And when you go into the exhibition, you can still see cutouts that are pinned, which is one of the really great things about this exhibition. There is one cutout in the very early section of it that still has pins in it. Let's do that again so you can just see how it works. Oops, maybe I can't. Oh, I have to press play. Okay. Anyway, you get the idea. Oh, there it goes. I'm not a dinosaur. I just have never done this before. You know, if I was a professor instead of a curator, I would be doing online courses or something. So instead, I'm looking at beautiful art every day, which is really nice. Okay, so after they are pinned to the wall, and you can see in the background there is a cutout, which is now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., he can still move them or have his studio assistants move them for him. So he can sit in his bed or in his wheelchair, and he can say to his studio assistant, could you move that pomegranate a little bit to the left, a little bit higher than the thigh of the nude on the wall? And he's no longer confined by the area of an easel, but rather can work with this wall that's right in front of him, or the wall to his right, or the wall behind him, or the ceiling. So what is she doing in this picture? Oops. Sorry. She's tracing. So what happens when he wants to have a show of his cutouts, which he did have? He has the studio assistant trace the works in the relationship that they are in, that is the one that's the most pleasing to him. And then they can send the tracing and the parts to his dealer in Paris, who has them professionally mounted, basically glued down, but I'll show you the mounting process. So here is his an exhibition of his cutouts in 1953, and this dealer arranged for the professional mounting of many cutouts, including some that we thought about for the exhibition. These two right here are in the Manil collection in Houston. And then you might recognize this is a standing sculpture from earlier in his career, which is in the third room of the exhibition in the Gun Gallery. But Matisse was very much involved in this mounting process, not physically, but in terms of making the decision that they should be laid down. And yet, there are differences in how that happens. This is the standard one. Tracing paper, then you put the forms in, you figure out where they're supposed to go, you lift the tracing paper, you trace, you glue, put them back down, mount it on a frame, there you go. So it's pretty sturdy. But you'll notice in the exhibition, if you look carefully at the cutouts, that some of them still retain this kind of light, airy effect, as if they're not entirely glued down. And this is one of them. This is a panel with mask, which is in the last room of the exhibition. Here you see it on the wall as part of a larger composition, still in process. This one is, oh, there, you see? I didn't even have to do that. It's like I didn't make this PowerPoint myself. I did, actually. It's still very light. It feels like it's slightly tacked down. It actually is so lightly tacked down that it was really difficult to convince the museum to let us hang it on the wall. They wanted to show it in a case. And we made our own very good case, I think, that it should be hung on the wall because we wanted to give the feeling of what it was like in the studio. And so it's really exceptional that it's able to be shown like that. And you'll notice in comparison with Mimosa, which is the cutout to its right, that this one is much sturdier in feel. It's really glued down the way that it was by the dealer. And also, apparently, although Jody may be able to set us on the right direction on Wednesday, apparently Lydia Delectorskaya was also involved in this mounting process, not just a professional mounter with the dealer. I hope that gives you a sense of at least what you can go and do in comparison. When you go back into the exhibition, you can look at details and see how they are glued down in different ways. And this one also has this very loose, tactile feeling. One thing we should say about this one before we move on is that it's called algae on a green background. Algae is one of Matisse's favorite forms. And he talked about creating forms like this by drawing and drawing and drawing them until he had created some kind of an essential version of it or a sign for it, which then was basically embedded in his memory and which he could smoothly cut out of the paper. So it's basically a spontaneous seeming motion, either the drawing or the cutting, which relies on this incredible knowledge and synthesis of form that he has developed, the way that a ballet dancer might learn how to do a pirouette. So let's go back, do a little art history, since you know my background is in 19th century art. We can go back to 1828 and this issue of drawing and color. So remember, this is another theme I said we're going to explore, which is the relationship of drawing and color, the unification of drawing and color in the cutouts and the late drawings. This is Delectorskaya and Ingres. We have paintings by both of these artists in the collection here, and they're dueling in front of the Institut de France about the relative importance of color, which is Delectorskaya's thing, and line, which is Ingres' thing. And this is a debate that's gone back basically as far as Botticelli. So if you want to do both exhibitions in one day, you can go and look at Botticelli in the Renaissance and think about how important color and line are to him and to the artists who came after him in that period. Disegno, colore. Disegno is associated with intellect and planning and arithmetic, and color is associated with passion and emotion. And you see in this early drawing by Matisse, also in the exhibition, that he's maybe playing with color swatches, perhaps when he's still in the studio of Gustave Moreau, or later. We've given it 1903, but I wonder if maybe this sheet is left over from an earlier period, and then drawing over it, maybe to see how the drawings relate to the color swatches. And this is the little chocolate pot and soup tureen. These are herons and an eggplant. And then to remind you also that he, although he starts late in his artistic career, in about age 20, comes into Paris and starts to pursue pretty traditional studies, doing nude models, drawing them from the nude in the studio. Fairly straightforward, representational, modeled, shadowed, nicely, nice variations of tone, smooth. Then getting something a little bit rougher, more energetic, and this is in our collection. It has a feeling of some of the spontaneity and fervor even of his work in the Fauvist period. And then to a work which is in the exhibition and is also in our collection, in which we see the white of the paper taking on a much greater impact, and we see him playing with line in a way that sort of affects the whiteness differently. So what that means is that you have the black used for incredible expressive effect around this contorted body that gives it its extraordinary energy, but you also see how he's allowed the white itself, so the negative space, to have this vibrancy of its own. And he talks about that a lot in this early period and then throughout his career, about how black and white are colors and how the white of the support or the surface that you're working on has its own vitality. He also, even in this early period, is working with what we might call essentials of form, getting things down to the reduced line that still has all of the energy and importance of the impact of this body on him. And with this sculpture, you might say that it looks like a drawing in sculpture, this idea of carving forms in air, which he later talks about in relationship to carving the cutouts with the scissors. Serpentine, the loops of the body carve the white spaces or the blank air around her. And he's worked with line in such a way that it gives us this incredible energy and expressiveness. So how then does he unite these with color? Well, color and line play an enormous role in this painting in the MoMA's collection, which often is exhibited in the same space as the Serpentine sculpture, which is a really nice combination if you get to see it in their permanent collection. And you see how he's using color for great expressive impact, and he uses colors that seem very pure, and also, although they might be flat, to have this incredible tension with the possibility of depth, that he's incorporating a lot of tensions within this otherwise joyful image that give it a more of an energy. So the tension between figure and ground, flatness and depth, color and line. And the line, like the line in some of the drawings that we just saw, carves out spaces in air or color. So many years later, in the 30s, he starts to work with a much larger project called The Dance, which is commissioned by Alfred Barnes of the Barnes Foundation in Marion, Pennsylvania, which is now in Philadelphia, as we all know. And to make this much larger project, and I wanted to give you a sense of how large it is by showing you, this is a woman lying down near it. This is the unfinished version, the first version he worked on, which is in Paris at the Musée de la Ville de Paris. And even just knowing that there's an unfinished version may give you a sense of how incredibly difficult this project was to work out, and that he made a mistake, which was measuring the size of the areas here in between the murals. So he had to abandon this one and then make another one. And for these very large murals, he ended up using, as a kind of device to work out the composition on a larger scale, he ended up using cutout forms. So this is the one that he eventually was installed in Philadelphia, and which you can now see to beautiful effect in the newly installed Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Here you see him working on sketches with putting a charcoal at the end of a long bamboo stick. Yeah, it's a great photo, right? And then in smaller versions. Now, maybe because we have the Botticelli exhibition on view now and we're looking at drawings and decorations, maybe think about the challenges of a modern artist working with what is essentially a very old system, working with an idea that is at first laid down on paper in a very small version, and then having to expand that idea to fit an architectural setting. And so instead of making huge drawings that he then pounces, which is what someone in Botticelli's circle might have done, he's making these cutout forms to then trace and be able to create his larger design. And the cutout, as a method, a working method really, it's a means to an end still, really takes hold in the 30s. And this is Two Dancers, which is another cutout which is still pinned. Here it is with thumbtacks. So you can see that theoretically, at least, you could still move those pieces around. I mean, please don't. But and it's for a decoration. So Rouge et Noir is a ballet. You learned about his decorations for ballets and operas a couple of weeks ago with the Boston Lyric Opera. This is one. But he also uses this cutout technique in the preparation of paintings. And here, this is the one that's in our exhibition in the Gund Gallery. And you can still see the pins. And you can see the holes where the pins used to be, which is so great. And you could still move this. You could still move the forms. You could still move the string, which is supposed to be the edge of a table. But the idea still in 1940, although he was getting closer to developing cutout as a technique in its own right, was to work toward a finished composition for a painting. But around this time, remember this is a critical period for him, really tough. He is his final separation from his wife Amélie. They divide all their things, their legal proceedings. It's really tough on him emotionally, as you can imagine. And he takes up a drawing project which is published in wartime on what he calls themes and variations, where he's looking at objects, including objects that are in our exhibition. This pewter jug, for example, the Chinese vase. And he's drawing them in different configurations, in different ways. He's moving things around. There's an enormous sense of flexibility. You also have the tensions that I mentioned before between foreground and background, flatness and depth, squiggly lines and straight lines. You can keep going and thinking about how those all affect you emotionally when you look at them. And that sense of continual change and alteration really takes hold in two projects that he dedicates himself to in the coming years, including a publication called Verve, which is published by somebody named Derived, who is a really insightful and important supporter from Matisse. And patient. They go through numerous different kinds of techniques to try to find the print technique that works the best for reproducing his cutouts. And Derived is also the publisher of Jazz, which is really when cutouts click for him as a technique in their own right. And that's when he starts to describe cutout and uses the language that I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of drawing with scissors. And he says, quote, "Drawing with scissors, cutting directly into vivid color, reminds me of the direct carving of sculptors. This book," and he's talking about Jazz, which is a portfolio of reproduced cutouts like this. This book was conceived in that spirit. So let's talk about the Dominican chapel of the Rosary in Voss and see what that means in terms of the ideas we've touched on a little bit. Essential forms, drawing with scissors, uniting color and form. This is a project that he began in early 1948. And it was completed in 1951, and you can still go and visit it. It's in Voss, as it says, so it's a very short trip outside of Nice, and you can still see Mass performed there. And it combines stained glass windows based on his cutouts with drawings on ceramic tile. This is the Stations of the Cross. Stained glass windows. And here he is in his Nice studio with the cutouts in process and the drawings. His studio is called The Factory, so before Andy Warhol. And he recreated the space, or really created it before it's even made, of this Dominican chapel. How did this all start? It's a wonderful story. When he was ill in Voss, he was nursed by a young woman who then became one of the nuns in this Dominican community in Voss, and she was called Sister Jacques, or Sœur Jacques. And when it came time for them to decorate their chapel, Sister Jacques went to Matisse for advice. And then they got some of the priests or brothers, Dominicans, involved with the project. And they were already excited about the idea of having modern artists work on church decoration. In this period, a lot of artists had turned away from the church for political reasons as well as religious reasons. So, for example, Picasso was a communist, and he was horrified that Matisse is involved with this project. And the question of whether Matisse did this for religious reasons is really one that's sort of still up in the air. He never denied it, and in fact, he actually said a number of things which make it seem very plausible that this was, for him, something very deeply felt. But there was also the idea that seems to have been a great motivator, that this was his opportunity to make an entire environment, a real decoration, a total work of art. Here you can see the scale model of the chapel here. You see these are windows that he'll decorate. These are for windows as well. This is St. Dominic. And he describes doing this drawing, just like a snail or the algae, drawing after drawing after drawing after drawing, and concentrating it and concentrating it and concentrating it until he could do it all quickly in one go, and it would seem spontaneous and light and effortless. And here is in Voss, in his other studio, its apartment. He has a plan for windows that were never constructed for that chapel. They were eventually constructed for a nursery in Le Cateau in the north of France, where Matisse grew up. They're called the bees, and I'll show them to you in another slide and explain why they're called that. And here on the side, you can see plans for those long windows. You can see drawings. Here are the bees. Those are bees, but they're also based on nuns' habits, which are called bees, the thing that you wear on your head. And then the other idea is that these cloistered bees, like nuns, had a great sense of community and working together, and that therefore it would be symbolic of this community around this chapel. And then those windows here, the starting point for them was this, which is much more abstract. And here you see it's on the wall, pinned to the wall next to the door. It seems much more abstract, but like all of Matisse's work, it starts with something in reality, which is supposed to be, at least, it's hard to make it out, the architecture of celestial Jerusalem from the book of Revelation. And then he felt like that was too sort of blocky and chaotic, and then he adds the algae leaves, which seem to have a more unifying effect. And then the maquette, or the cutout. Maquette is basically a planning device, but the one that was eventually mounted is at the Pompidou. So these are the two. You can compare them. And then eventually it ends up looking like this, which is quite different, and you see how it's a reduced color scheme, so just blue and green, and then the algae forms are left as the white light, from there to there. The last thing he worked on for this chapel were the priest's robes, art you can wear, which really do make it a total work of art, one that is always changing, shifting, depends on environmental, human factors. Here, this is the view that the priest has. And then think back to your Boston Lyric Opera lecture. The Song of the Nightingales was the ballet that Matisse had worked on so long ago when he had used cutouts to design the sets and costumes. The chasubles that we have in the exhibition were also for the priests. These are plans for vestments that were made. This one is quite easy to read as a cross, and then this one is a tree of life. All right. So with jazz and with the Dominican chapel of the Rosary in Voss, cutouts have clicked. This is what he's going to be doing, cutouts and drawings for the rest of his life. And here he is in bed. Oh, actually, let me read you one thing before we go on. Matisse said, when the chapel was consecrated on June 25th, 1951, Matisse wrote to the priest because he couldn't attend the opening because he was too ill. He said, "This work is the outcome of 4 years of exclusive and concentrated work, and it is the result of all my active life. Despite all its imperfections, I consider it as my masterpiece." So now something that's a little closer to the last section of the exhibition, essential forms, the idea of essential forms, and how drawings and cutouts work together in this period in his life. Here we have Matisse in bed with the Chinese calligraphic panel above him that is in the exhibition. And underneath each one of the glyphs, you see a drawing of a nude. And Matisse talked about this panel, and he said that one of the things that he liked so much about it, the panel had actually been a birthday present to him in 1929 for his 60th birthday. Isn't it amazing? He was 60 in 1929, and he lives till 1954. And he said that one of the things he liked about it so much was that it's carved into wood, but it looks like it's protruding into our space. So it has that relationship with recession and protrusion, figure and ground, that he's aiming for in his drawings. And he also likes that these are pictorial signs which have basically been honed down to their essence, so like the drawings of the nudes. The other thing you might want to notice about this, of course, here's St. Dominic. He's in bed and he's making cutout. And he has this whole environment around him. Here are objects that he's put in vitrines. You can see some of these vitrines at the Musée Matisse in Nice still. Here's the Chinese panel. And here are some of the drawings of nudes in the exhibition that are so reduced and yet so powerful, so essential that it's almost impossible to tell which one is a female, which one's a male, where they begin, where they end. And since it's an interpretation of a couple embracing, that it's perfect for the subject. And that's another thing to keep in mind about the works of this period, is that Matisse is matching form to subject matter, sometimes extraordinarily well, like this, of course. And here is our reclining nude, and this is Lydia Delectorskaya, the woman who began as his studio model and became his manager and helpmate till the end of his life. So with these nudes, well, eventually the nude drawings and the nude cutouts have a relationship. I mean, they always have. But with the cutouts, you see how color plays such an important role, but also how line continues to play such an important role. And that with the white line, basically, which is just negative space, separates form from form and creates this dynamism as well as definition. And that the forms around the forms are just as important as the forms themselves. So the nude here is actually the white of the paper, and the cutout are these elements that are leftovers. So everything keeps moving and changing. The objects move from place to place. The cutouts move from place to place. Here the Chinese panel is, well, I believe that it's against a different wall, unless the bed itself moved, which is entirely possible. And we can all ask Jody that next week on Wednesday if you come to the talk. And here, underneath each one of the glyphs is a cutout. Again, some of them are nudes. Eventually, these nudes will be joined by monkeys to become the cutout that we know as Women and Monkeys. Here's another work that eventually becomes one cutout, which is in the collection of Louis Vuitton, or LVMH. And then this is part of the cutout that becomes parakeet and mermaid. This is the parakeet. These are the algae forms, pomegranates, but it's stretched from one wall to another. And see how loosely it's pinned here, just floating off the wall? Here's what it looks like eventually. It's huge. So again, focusing on this little section here, keep that in your head. Here it appears above a doorway in a room that contains the cutout known as the swimming pool, which was the starting point for the MoMA exhibition, because it's in the collection of MoMA. It hadn't been shown for ages and ages because it was in such a kind of tenuous state of conservation. The conservators were really worried about it, that if it were shown that some great damage might happen to it. It was pinned to burlap originally, and they needed to figure out a way to be able to show it again. And they thought, well, once we finished with this extraordinary conservation project, then we'll have an exhibition. And it turned into the exhibition to end all exhibitions on the cutouts. One of the things they did was get a new ground for it, and also hang it again at the height that it was supposed to be shown, which is up here, instead of much further down, which is how it had been shown in subsequent years. So why is this such a special, huge cutout? Well, one of the things you notice is this wave-like feeling. It's like the arabesque, which is a form that Matisse appreciated so much in North African art that he collected. It's also like waves in a pool. These are figures. Here are close-ups. They're negative and positive shapes, swimmers, scraps that then become waves. And it had such a personal connection to him because he had actually gone to a pool and not been able to go in. He just didn't feel that he could swim anymore, and so he made this swimming pool for himself, so he would have it at home all around him. It's one of the moments like his creation of gardens around him where he says, I couldn't go out walking, and so I made my own garden at home for myself. Matisse is highly quotable. And then the leaping bodies. It's really wonderful. So our last section, we'll talk about this idea of decoration. And this brings us back to some of the other objects in the exhibition. And it also helps us understand the role of these brush drawings in his last large projects. So all of you have seen this while hanging in the exhibition, and you get a sense of how enveloping it can be, and also how the light shining through it might have an extraordinary effect, but that is an environmental factor which would change throughout the day. Here is a photograph in his apartment at the Hotel Regina, which he wasn't living in as a hotel. I should clarify that. It's an apartment. The light shining through the mashrabia or Haiti. And then these Cuba claws or prestige claws, which are from Central Africa and which have a pattern to them as well, but it's a pattern that is asymmetric and doesn't seem to be as regular or defined or ending as patterns that we might think of in conventional French textiles. Instead, it seems to be ever evolving and changing, because that is actually how it was made by the African craftsmen who made it. It starts off without a set plan and evolves. in some ways similar to how things are happening on the surface of the walls in his studio. And notice up here, he's pinned up. These are amazing. We don't have any of these in the exhibition, but these are white lino cuts. And that's another thing we might explore in depth in a future exhibition. Matisse's incredible printmaking. Here up here, you can see Cuba cloth. I think it's the same one, but he had a number in his collection. So in some ways, it's really pleasant to study these cutouts, but in other ways, it's so difficult to think about the fact that the studio itself is so much at the core of them, and we can never really go back to the studio. It's almost as if it's like a performance art piece that we can never see again. So how do these, here you can see in the mirrors, you can see cutouts, huge painting or drawing, more plain trees, these are trees. These trees are plans for ceramic tiles for the house of Derived, the publisher who published Verve, the art magazine that Matisse made the covers for and contributed to, and who also published Jazz. So Derived wanted Matisse to make ceramic decorations for him. So in the same kind of technique that he used for the Voss chapel. And these tree motifs, or what he chose, we have one of them in the collection. We have one in the exhibition. I wish it was in the collection. It's actually from the collection of the Magd family, which was another publisher of Matisse's prints, which still has a gallery in Paris that you can visit, and which has a foundation in Voss. So you can visit that as well as the Voss chapel when you go to Voss. The tree and this brush-like imagery, you might wonder, how does it work in terms of these themes that we've been talking about? Well, the connection to decoration seems quite clear because it's really large. It is a plan for a ceramic tile. What about this idea of uniting color and line? Well, you think about the idea of black and white also being colors, and the brush strokes defining forms. Going back over, this white probably would have matched the color of the paper, so we might not be able to see it really as part of the composition. But this idea of ever-changing form, that he would have gone over dark lines that he had made and basically erased them or changed them. And in the background of this drawing, you can actually see blue lines as well. You can't see it in the slide. So this idea of growth and vitality and change is something that's really still very important to him, and which he talked about in terms of the Chinese artists that he held up as kind of ideal figures. He said, I've been told what the Chinese professors tell their students: when you draw a tree, have the feeling of growing with it when you begin at the bottom. And he also said, I shan't get free of my emotion by copying the tree faithfully, but only after identifying myself with it. I have to create an object that resembles the tree, the sign for the tree. The truly original artist invents his own signs. So what does he mean exactly by making signs? Because he says that making signs is what he has been aiming for all his life. And he talks about this in terms of the calligraphic panel, in terms of Chinese artists, in terms of something he calls, and which I thought would be a great title for the last section of the exhibition, Serenity through Simplification. But then we thought about it, we thought it might sound a little bit too much like a spa, which I think I probably was looking for at the end of the installation. But here's the quote. We work towards serenity through simplification of ideas and form. Details lessen the purity of the lines and harm the emotional intensity. We reject them. Sometimes I have to laugh because it's just so serious. But I think that maybe it was Peter Cobb who talked to you about how Matisse had discussed the lack of necessity for details anymore in the wake of photography. We no longer have to focus as artists on the details of the world around us, but rather on something even more important, which is the reality beneath those details. And we get to that through this process of drawing and thinking and intensification, and we create something which he called a sign. He said, one must study an object a long time to know what its sign is. Yet, in a composition, the object becomes a new sign that helps to maintain the force of the whole. In a word, each work of art is a collection of signs. And that's certainly true of the cutouts, because he has these essential forms, which he hones. Okay, I got so excited that I lost my pointer. Oh, there it is. Okay. Like these flowers and the faces. And then he can reuse them and change them, and they change according to where they're placed. What is the relationship between these two different colors? What is the relationship between the faces and the flowers? What is the relationship with this cutout with the environment in which it's hung, the architecture of the environment or the other works that are hung around it? These are particular challenges for a curator, for example, when you're trying to figure out how you're going to arrange a room when you're dealing with an artist who is so conscious of that himself. So with these brush drawings, I think that this one in particular gives you a really good sense of how they never really seem to end. It's as if the drawing could keep going off into the white space around it. And it's sort of unfortunate that I created a beige background for this slide, because against a white wall, you really do get a sense of the energetic, ever-expansive space that he creates with these lines. And also this sense of joy and happiness, really in the face of so many things that have had the potential in his life to hold him back or make him sad. And that's another thing that I thought was so nice about Peter Cobb's lecture, is talking about his response to wartime really seems to have been to create its opposite. So here are some of the elements of the decoration we just saw, or a related one that's in the Musée Matisse Nice, along with two other cutouts from very late in his career. This one called Memory of Oceania, this one a little sliver of the snail, and then here an acrobat that's in the show. Swooping, the perfect matching of subject matter and form with the energetic twisting of the acrobat's body, really watching a body as it performs and how your arm performs, creating it with this long brushed motion on paper. With the Memory of Oceania, which is, oh, let me go back to this, right here. He's thinking back, we have to assume, to his period in 1930 when we really started the lecture in 1930, when he travels to the United States, and he also goes to Tahiti, and he meets with Barnes, and he thinks about the dance mural. He eventually creates this cutout, which if it weren't for the title, we might assume was entirely abstract. And I do have a closer view of it. But as his son-in-law pointed out, and his son-in-law became one of his art historians, essentially, making catalogs of his work, Matisse himself had said that he never started without an object in mind. He said, quote, deep within himself, this is Matisse, the artist must have a real memory of the object, of an object, and of the reactions it produces in his mind. One starts off with an object, and sensation follows. So in this, then, even though it seems so abstract to us, it's not non-referential, which is what a lot of artists in the 50s were doing, and which artists had been doing since earlier in the 20th century, which is creating abstract compositions with no object referent. They weren't symbols or signs or derived from something that you saw in real life, but rather were entirely abstract and only referential within themselves and to ideas. And And Matisse really just did not believe in that, and he talked about that a great deal, and I think it's really important to think about that in terms of his late work, that with works like Memory of Oceania and The Snail, so here's a snail, that as abstract as they might look, they are still abstractions from, not entirely non-referential and abstract within themselves. Matisse had said, "There is no break between my early pictures and my cutouts, except that with greater completeness and abstraction, I have attained a form filtered to its essentials." Well, with The Snail, especially, and with Memory of Oceania, and thinking back about Matisse's career and the kind of chances and choices that he took, the idea of working with a kind of childish perspective on the world, meaning that you are unhindered by the ideas about what things you can and can't do, what you should and shouldn't do, sort of naturally springs to mind. And Matisse himself, at the very end of his life, in 1953, wrote an essay about looking at life with the eyes of a child. And it's interesting because this is a theme that seems to come up in discussions of so many great artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, and there's a kind of a popular how-to book out there now called Thinking Like Leonardo, and it's being billed to business students, so you can have a great idea and you don't have to squelch it just because you don't think your boss might like it. Keep going, and he might, or you might get fired. I don't know. But what Matisse said was, quote, "The effort needed to see things without distortion demands a kind of courage. And this courage is essential to the artist, who has to look at everything as though he were seeing it for the first time. He has to look at life as he did when he was a child." So I actually have a little bit of extra time to be able to take questions now, and we can also go back and revisit some of the sections of the lecture. So please ask questions. Yes. Oh, we're going to have microphones.
Oh, hold on one second. Microphone's on the way. Can you raise your hand, whoever starts speaking?
That is not a stupid question at all. Thank you for asking. The question is, why is this picture called a snail? So at first, I thought that this was an entirely abstract composition too. But this is supposed to be the snail's head, and this is supposed to be the shell. And there's actually this really great cutout that's related, which I wish I'd put in, that shows something that's a little bit closer to what a snail might look like in your head. And that Matisse talks about in terms of this idea of drawing and drawing and drawing until you have something that's essential. And in this case, yes, it's very abstract, but it starts off with the idea of a snail. Okay, good. Yep.
In looking at the exhibit and looking closely at some of his paintings, sometimes they almost seem like unfinished. And I'm wondering, did he do that on purpose, or did he just not finish the painting? How that really came about.
Well, that's a very good question, and there are a few answers for that, and it depends on which work we're looking at. But, so something like the still life with shell, and I'll go back to it. Oops, I better go back this way. Let me... Sorry, close your eyes if you can't stand this. I have a really hard time with it, too. So still life with shell, you could think of as being unfinished. Here it is. It's a work in process. It ended up like this, and this is how he ended up putting it on his studio wall, and he didn't sell it. But the possibility still remains that you could, or he could, change it. He can't obviously change it anymore, but it's a work in process. So it's like a working drawing. But there are paintings in the exhibition that look like they're unfinished that he's signed. And in those cases, usually they are part of a process, and that is a finished part of the process, if that makes any sense. That the unfinished quality may be part of what he was looking for, or that may have just been enough, and then he moved on to a different burst of creativity and outlet or reaction to something. And that's true of some of the works around the Rokai chair. That may have been one that you're thinking of, with the gray charcoal drawing on canvas, which is near the Rokai chair. That, I don't think it's an unfinished work. I think it's a drawing on canvas, and then that was enough. Yes?
There's one in the back. Sorry, hold on one second.
Oh, wait,
there's someone waiting in the back.
Okay.
On the other side.
Going back to the technique of the cutouts, do you know what kind of a paste they used to tack them on? Is there, was it all archival materials used at the time, or is there damage done to the cutouts because of the paste that was used to tack them?
That is a very good question also, and the best person to ask that, I'll try to answer it shortly here, but you should come to the lecture next Wednesday and ask Jody Halpman that, because she's the curator from MoMA who worked closely with Carl Buchberg, who is the conservator of the cutouts and the leading conservator of the cutouts in the world. He was the conservator who was in charge of the swimming pool conservation, and he and his assistants did work on the kinds of inks that were used, on the kinds of glue, the technique for mounting them. And what I know is that it was done professionally for the most part by a professional mount maker. But the type of glue that was available then, I'm sure they used the best that they possibly could, but it wouldn't have been the same archival standard that we have now. So yes, sometimes things like that do affect the degeneration of a work of art over time. A lot of the cutouts have held up amazingly well. So they haven't experienced as much trauma, you might say, as you would expect. Yeah.
Why did his wife leave him?
No.
Sorry.
That is a very good question. I'm not sure that I can say. I mean, I chose not to marry a passionate artist, but you know, it's funny. The histories say that after she left him, she seemed to be extraordinarily energetic in comparison with how she had felt before. She had to go to sanatoriums, like spas, to rest and calm her nerves frequently during their marriage. I don't know, it sounds like it was pretty difficult. And it sounds like she was somebody who really wanted to make it work, but that it eventually didn't. But this wasn't, if you're trying to figure out if he had loads of affairs and was kind of a Picasso in disguise, that isn't what we know about him. If that was true, then it's been extremely well hidden by history.
Yes, could you say whether the Cone sisters in Baltimore were too early for his cutouts, or did they collect some of that work too? Because there are many important Matisses in their collection.
That's really interesting because they have so many Matisses in their collection. And I wonder if it was because they were too early, or if there was a rupture because of politics or just their ages. See, their collection goes through the late 30s. You know, I'm sorry to say I don't really know, but that's an excellent question. And I think that you may be right, that it's because of history and that they were already mature when they knew him in his younger years. But no, they don't really have cutouts. They have an amazing drawing collection in Baltimore from the Cones and this incredible painting collection. And there's still a very important exhibition on view in San Francisco that includes quite a bit of the Cone collection called Diebenkorn Matisse, which I highly recommend seeing.
It's such a treat for all of us to have a curator here. And I think all of us would like to know more about your curatorial vision for this show, and in particular, where you feel you fully realized your intent, where you're the proudest, and also if there were any spots where you couldn't achieve it because you couldn't borrow what you wanted or anything else that may be the next exhibition you work on.
Well, let me give you a little background of the exhibition. There were 3 curators. There was a professor from Wheaton College named Ellen McBreen, and normally she would be giving a lecture this spring as well, but she has just had twins. And she and I went to school at the Institute of Fine Arts together, and she studied Matisse. I studied Manet. I mean, everybody studies everything, but then you at some point have to specialize. And she wrote a book on Matisse's sculpture. And in the process of doing that, she spent a lot of time at the Musée Matisse Nice and paid attention to the objects and thought that they might be a really interesting concept for an exhibition. So she came to me with this idea, and we worked on it together. And then we worked with a very experienced curator from the Royal Academy in London named Anne Dumas, who's a Degas specialist. She's done loads of really important international exhibitions. So I felt like Ellen and I had worked out a really good checklist, and then Anne Dumas and Matthew Teitelbaum coming on as director really kind of bumped it to the next level of ambition and the ability to get extraordinary loans. So in terms of how it looks in the galleries, that has a lot to do with our team at the MFA, including a great designer named Chelsea Garanay, who is on staff. And I worked with her on the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition, the drawings exhibition we did, and she also did textile, if you remember that. So she's versatile. She's a really great listener and collaborator. We had a really nice time working together. And I also worked closely with our manager of interpretation, whose name is Adam Tessier. And that's part of Matthew Teitelbaum's impact also on the strategy for exhibitions, is encouraging the curator to work with that team from a very early point. So things I'm most proud of. Well, I love the center section in terms of how the architecture and the works of art come together to kind of create a cohesive environment, which is really beautiful. One of my favorite sections in terms of Matisse's art and the connections you can make visually is also in the next to the last space, where you can see the Serpentine and the calligraphic panel and the drawings of Nudes and the acrobat and the Nang Torané figure. And being able to see things in all of those different media and make those connections, I think that really connects me to my experience working in artist studios in New York while I was in grad school. And even though I'm a curator of prints and drawings here, I've always studied and been interested in a range of media. It just seemed like very natural fit for me personally, but also because of my contact and knowledge of artist studios and the way that the artists that I like have worked don't tend to work just in one media at one time. It tends to be like a really, I mean, it's just much more exciting to be able to put something down, take something else up, think about something else, and have all these piles all over the place. So one thing I wish that we could have gotten, well, it would have been really nice to get the blue nude from Baltimore. But they were having their own great exhibition, and they needed to still have their iconic Matisse among the 40 or 50 other Matisses in their galleries. So, yeah. They were really supportive in other ways. They lent to the exhibition, so. Anyone else?
Right in the middle. Right in the middle.
I'm wondering, I think of these cutouts as so beloved by so many people, and I'm imagining artists as well. And I wonder, and maybe this is my own ignorance, of why, or what's your theory on why more artists haven't embraced that cutout as a material, as a technique, and maybe secondarily, who would you think of in terms of Matisse's contemporary successors to that kind of working?
Well, in terms of artists that I would think of as being really interested in this idea of the overall kind of work of art that stretches beyond the frame and becomes an environment, I think that he has descendants in artists who were working in completely different media from the cutouts. Like, for example, James Turrell, who's working with light, Saul LeWitt with his wall drawings. I mean, even Ellsworth Kelly, too. And Ellsworth Kelly readily acknowledged his debt to Matisse, and in fact did a really beautiful exhibition where he picked drawings from a collection of Matisse drawings and arranged them himself. So yeah, I think that I think maybe the inheritors of the cutouts are children who love to make cutouts, and that the inheritors of the kind of ideas that lie behind it are in these more environmental artists. Even Smithson and the earth-based artists, that kind of, or Christo. Yeah.
Many years ago, when my children were in the 1st and 2nd grade, they used to do cutouts.
Yeah.
And it didn't look too dissimilar from this. And I'm wondering, how did the art critics of the time period look upon his cutouts?
So since we just have a few more minutes left, why don't I take this question in the front as well, and then I'll try to combine the answers.
Yeah, so is this on? So just a couple of quick technical questions. I was thinking about the slide you showed with the 2 faces and all of the cutouts. And you kind of answered this already, I think, but did he never ever make a pattern and just always do all of those pieces completely freehand, even though they look so similar? It would seem really tempting to just trace a pattern and then be able to cut them out.
Like have the studio assistants cut them
and
out?
They're so similar too.
Apparently he didn't. And if you look at the cutouts, and this is something that might address your question as well. So look at the cutouts in the galleries, and some of the things that will maybe set them apart from children's art, or not, because children can make extraordinary things too. Look at how he selected the papers, that there is an individuality to all of the different papers that he selected. Look at the carving of them, and how it's really evident that they don't follow a pattern, but rather each have a life of their own. Look at how their placement and the overall effect. One thing that children do, for example, and I've watched this before, you can end up with a really lovely work of art made by your child, but it's usually because you took it away from the child before he or she was done, right? So, you know, Matisse is not alone in this, but great artists know when to stop. Maybe a good point for us to end our discussion today.
My second...